Britain has changed a lot in the last 70 years. Go back to the early 50s and you'll find a nation still repairing after the destruction of the Second World War. A nation where rationing was still in place. Back then, Britain was an industrial world power, and it still had an empire, albeit one that was slowly being dismantled. Fast forward to the 21st century though, and the difference is huge. Britain is a multicultural society. It's a world leader in culture, not heavy industry. The British Empire no longer exists, and Britain are no longer deferential to authority. Politicians are mocked and laughed at. In short, Britain now is almost completely different from Britain in 1952. Well, apart from one key aspect: Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen's role is a unique one in modern society. She reigns, but she does not rule. She can't vote, appear as a witness in court, or change her faith. But, despite her lack of tangible power, she influences her people by example, living out the principles of unity, service, and dignity. In these links to Sally Bedell Smith's biography, Elizabeth the Queen, we'll reveal key instances in which the Queen has done just that, from her coronation in 1953 through to her Diamond Jubilee in 2012. Hundreds of thousands of spectators thronged together in the wind, rain and cold one morning in 1953. They stood, cheek to cheek, alongside some of London's most famous landmarks: Trafalgar Square, Oxford Circus, Buckingham Palace, to see a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle. The event was, of course, the coronation procession of Queen Elizabeth II. It was more than a year earlier when Elizabeth's father, George VI, had died in his sleep. At that very moment, Elizabeth became Queen. In response, Prime Minister Winston Churchill had heralded the forthcoming era as a new Elizabethan age. Churchill's message reinvigorated the public at a time when Britain was struggling with shortages, destruction left over from World War II, and fears of a communist expansion in the Cold War. And Churchill was a major presence during Elizabeth's coronation preparations, even perhaps her most ardent cheerleader. The British Bulldog had met Elizabeth when she was just 2 years old, declaring that he sensed from her an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant. Elizabeth has carried that air of authority with her throughout her reign, which began on that blustery day in 1953. She was whisked to Westminster in the extravagant gold state coach, wearing her great-great-grandmother's diadem and white satin coronation crown. The maids of honour fitted her with the monarch's crimson velvet robe of state, with its 18-foot-long train trimmed with ermine and gold lace. As they began picking it up to carry it behind her, Elizabeth looked over her shoulder and asked, "Ready, girls?" She was then led into the Abbey, where she approached and then stood by King Edward's chair, the one on which she'd sit to be crowned. The Archbishop began the recognition, which presented to her the 7,500 distinguished guests. After that, she swore the coronation oath, in which she pledged to honour the laws of Great Britain and all its territories and realms. Next, it was time for the most spiritual part of the ceremony, the anointing. Elizabeth's robe, gloves, jewellery and diadem were removed. She was helped into a plain white shift with a pleated skirt. This gave her the appearance of youth and vulnerability, and indeed Elizabeth was just 25 years old. The Archbishop of Canterbury poured holy oil from a gold ampulla into a silver gilt spoon and anointed Elizabeth. Then, coronation robes weighing 36 pounds and made of stiff woven gold cloth were placed on her. These were garments meant to signify that God had sanctified her to serve her people until death. From the crowd, Elizabeth's first child, the 4-year-old Prince Charles, watched with wide eyes. He sat between his grandmother, the Queen Mother, and his aunt Elizabeth's younger sister, Princess Margaret. "Look, it's Mummy," he said to his grandmother, who looked on with an expression of sadness mixed with pride. Meanwhile, Margaret held back tears. She felt as if she was losing her big sister to this all-important duty so soon after losing her father too. Wearing the gold robes, Elizabeth was presented with her regalia, which included gold bracelets, a coronation ring, jewelled sceptres, and an orb topped by precious jewels. The Archbishop blessed the solid gold crown, held it aloft, and then placed it on her head. Cannons exploded in Hyde Park and the Tower of London, while shouts of "God Save the Queen" rang out from the Abbey. The nature of the Queen's role is simultaneously one of change and constancy. She remains on the throne regardless of who leads Parliament, and as such, she's had to develop relationships with all of the Prime Ministers who have held office since her reign began. The first and most significant of them all was, of course, Winston Churchill. After Elizabeth's coronation, her already close bond with Churchill grew even closer. They connected over their shared experiences during World War II, and both loved breeding and racing horses. These topics were commonly on the table during their weekly Tuesday evening meetings. Churchill yielded his premiership at the age of 80 in 1955. During his farewell dinner, he toasted the Queen as a young, gleaming champion of the sacred causes and wise and kindly way of life. Afterward, Elizabeth wrote in a letter to Churchill that no other Prime Minister would ever for me be able to hold the place of my first Prime Minister. After and including Churchill, Elizabeth's Prime Ministers were a string of Conservatives: Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan and Alec Douglas-Home. Labour, the UK's left-wing party, didn't win premiership until Harold Wilson in 1964. The Queen is obliged to disregard the Prime Minister's political leanings. However, Wilson's divergence from his predecessor's views did create some humorous moments. After Wilson implemented a policy called social contract for labour unions, one of the Queen's men suggested that that would be a good name for one of her young horses. The look she gave him in response was bleak. Despite Wilson's apparent mismatch with the institution of the monarchy, he would have died for her within 3 months of meeting the Queen, according to the Queen Mother. While Churchill was something of a father figure to Elizabeth, her relationship with Wilson was one more of friendship. He found to his surprise that he could relax around her and that she was genuinely interested in hearing what he had to say. Years later, in 1978-79, the UK experienced what became known as the Winter of Discontent. The Prime Minister James Callaghan struggled to revive Britain's stagnant economy. Temperatures plunged to some of the coldest on record, and a high volume of strikes crippled the country. Even the gravediggers went on strike. It was therefore no surprise that in 1979, in the general election, the Conservative Party won handily, making Margaret Thatcher not just the new Prime Minister, but the first female to hold that role. Perhaps Thatcher had been right when, 27 years earlier, she'd written that Elizabeth's accession could help remove the last shreds of prejudice against women aspiring to the highest places. Thatcher and Elizabeth had quite a bit in common. They were both born within 6 months of each other, which made it easier to relate. Plus, they were both mothers, and at the same time professional, hard-working women who'd found ways to thrive in male-dominated spheres. However, there were also points that kept them distant from one another. Thatcher lacked the Queen's sense of humour, and she tended to dominate conversations and lecture at people, which the Queen disliked. Both women were reluctant to discuss their feelings, which meant that they could never quite form a deeper, more personal bond. Thatcher was deeply deferential to the monarch. According to diplomat Charles Powell, no one could curtsy lower than Margaret Thatcher. But even so, she found herself at odds with the Queen just 3 months after taking office. At that time, the white minority government of the British territory Rhodesia was under threat from the majority black guerrilla forces led by Marxist Robert Mugabe. Worried about the potential threat the guerrilla forces posed, Thatcher tried to dissuade the Queen from attending a proposed peace conference there. Elizabeth, however, insisted on attending. She always sided with the Commonwealth, even if she could never say so directly, and she feared that other African countries would try to leave the Commonwealth unless the black majority forces led by Mugabe could be allowed to take charge of the Rhodesian government. She visited several of those countries, including Tanzania, Malawi, Botswana, and Zambia, before making her way to the conference in Rhodesia. The night of the conference, she stayed up until midnight, speaking with various heads of state. One of the Nigerian delegates stated his belief that the Queen's intervention convinced the organisation, which was on the point of possibly splitting up, to compromise. Behind the scenes, she continued speaking to the African leaders privately in her bungalow. She conveyed sympathy for them and displayed genuine knowledge of their problems. This impressed the leaders and made them feel as if she really did truly care. In doing so, the Queen brought down the temperature of the situation and enabled Thatcher to better facilitate the Lusaka Accord, which called for a constitutional conference in London later that year. The Queen's presence had made it happen. Calm amidst the storm. The Queen sat atop her 19-year-old black mare, Burmese, which had been a gift from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The year, 1981. The month, June. And the Queen was enjoying her birthday parade in the sun. The celebration came just a few weeks away from her son Charles's marriage to Lady Diana Spencer. The pair had begun a fast-paced courtship a year earlier during a house party in Sussex. The press and public alike had immediately fallen in love with the alluring, shy, charismatic Diana. But her relationship with Charles was fraught from the beginning. Diana's difficult childhood had left her with deep scars that resulted in emotional instability, a tendency to lie, and obsessive behaviours. For the moment, though, things were calm. The Queen had practised her side saddle technique every day in the 2 weeks leading up to her birthday celebration. Wearing the scarlet tunic of the West Guards and a navy blue riding skirt, she sat perfectly upright in the saddle with the reins in her left hand and riding crop in her right. Charles and Philip rode behind her with the members of the household cavalry. But just before 11 a.m, as the Queen turned right towards the parade ground, the unthinkable happened. 6 gunshots rang out from within the crowd. The horse cantered forward, having been startled, but the Queen remained firmly in charge. She calmly and instinctively settled Burmese by pulling on both of the reins, as guards and members of the crowd tackled the gunman. The shots, fortunately, had been blanks. This wouldn't be the first time the Queen would need to calm a startled horse in the midst of an important event. Almost exactly a year later, in June 1982, Ronald and Nancy Reagan had come to Windsor Castle to visit the Queen and Prince Philip as personal guests. The first American presidential couple to stay overnight at Windsor Castle. The highlight of the trip was a horseback ride that the President Reagan and the Queen were scheduled to take together, which would serve as an excellent photo opportunity for the American leader. At 9:30 a.m, the Queen and the President mounted their horses, she again on Burmese and he on an 8-year-old stallion called Centennial. Both chose to forego helmets. The pair rode for an hour, greeting farmers in the fields and waving to onlookers. At one point, Reagan was waving so much that he began riding the horse straight towards the water. This prompted the Queen to grab hold of his reins and begin leading the horse herself. In Reagan's words, she was in charge of that animal. Despite the mishap, the day was a key moment in what would become a long-lasting, deep, and genuine friendship between the British royal family and the Reagans. Just a month later, Elizabeth once again showed her pluck in the face of danger. At 7:15 a.m, she heard the slam of a door. It couldn't be Philip. He'd already left that morning for an engagement elsewhere, and her staff were never so careless. When she sat up in her bed, she was faced with the sight of a barefooted man wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He was opening her curtains, and he held a shard of glass in his hand. Blood dripped from his thumb as he walked over to sit at the foot of her bed. "Get out of here at once," the Queen shouted. But the intruder, Michael Fagan, who had in fact already managed to sneak into the palace once before, began venting to the Queen about his personal problems. To keep him calm, the Queen listened patiently and commented sympathetically, all while trying to summon help using the emergency button in her room. Despite the shock of the situation, her demeanour remained preternaturally calm. After Fagan requested a cigarette, the Queen showed him to a nearby pantry. There, she encountered a chambermaid and a footman with the Queen's pack of corgi dogs in tow. The dogs barked whilst the footman distracted Fagin with a drink. Finally, a police contingent arrived to take him away. The Queen later described the event as surreal rather than scary. As always, she had been the calm amidst the storm. The Queen arrived in Washington on Tuesday, May 14, 1991, in the thick of the Gulf War. She spent 3 days in Washington attending 18 engagements, then visited 6 cities in Florida and Texas before making her way back to London. Despite the hectic schedule, the Queen would remember the time as one of peace, compared to what she'd soon deal with upon her return. By this time, Prince Charles and Princess Diana were near their 10th wedding anniversary, and the pre-existing fractures in their marriage had worsened. Charles had reignited his affair with his former girlfriend Camilla, while Diana had done the same with her former riding instructor, James Hewitt. The tabloids were already ablaze, but the drama was poised to soon become a conflagration. Andrew Morton, a writer for the Sun tabloid, had begun writing a book exposing the royal drama, with Princess Diana as his secret collaborator. Meanwhile, the Queen's younger son, Prince Andrew, and his then-wife Sarah, Fergie Ferguson, were busy partying in their new £3.5 million mansion. While Andrew was away, Fergie enjoyed lavish vacations abroad in Morocco, Switzerland and France, sometimes accompanied by American millionaire Steve Wyatt. At Christmas time, Andrew and Fergie told the Queen that they were considering a separation. After Fergie was photographed in Morocco with Wyatt less than a month later, Andrew brought in his lawyers, and the separation was officially announced March of 1992. The worst, however, was still to come. June 1992 would mark the Queen's 40th year on the throne. Under ordinary circumstances, the month would be marked by celebrations and tributes to that significant milestone. But before any of that could get underway, the Sunday Times published its first excerpt from Andrew Morton's book titled Diana, Her True Story. It went into gory details about Diana's emotional problems, portrayed Charles as unfaithful and uncaring, and painted a remote and almost alien picture of the royal family. Diana lied, insisting that she hadn't been involved, but it wasn't long before the truth came to light. The day the book was officially released, Charles and Diana met with the Queen and Prince Philip. Charles said little, but Diana was in tears, continuing to reiterate that she hadn't helped the book's author. The subject of divorce was brought up, but Elizabeth and Philip advised the couple to stay together and learn to compromise. The next day, Diana and Charles were requested to return, but Diana failed to show up. Instead, she packed up her things and left Windsor Castle entirely. This prompted Prince Philip to write her a letter offering marriage advice, the first of a long series of exchanges between the two. Diana seemed to genuinely appreciate Philip's advice, yet he failed to change her mind. The saga of Fergie and Andrew was also far from over. On August 20th, Fergie was photographed lounging topless in the French Riviera with her 2 children and her financial advisor, John Bryan. Other photographs depicted Bryan kissing Fergie's toes and embracing her in front of one of the children. The display was humiliating for the whole royal family, and for Fergie most of all. She apologised to the furious Queen, and she was barred from returning to the family's Scottish estate in Balmoral for 16 years. 4 days after the story about Fergie broke, Diana was back in the news again. The Sun published an article headlined, "My Life is Torture," which quoted from a surreptitiously recorded telephone conversation between Diana and a friend named James Gilby. During the conversation, Gilby infamously referred to Diana as Squidgy, and Diana made a series of disparaging and bitter remarks about her family. Everything came to a crescendo on Friday, November 20th, the 45th wedding anniversary of the Queen and Philip. Elizabeth was beginning an appointment late in the morning when she received a phone call from Prince Andrew. Part of Windsor Castle was ablaze. The fire destroyed or damaged 9 staterooms and over 100 others. To the Queen, the fire symbolised a divine punishment for the royal family's behaviour. The cost of repairs was estimated to be between £20 and £40 million. A few days after the fire, the Queen appeared in the Guildhall in the City of London for a luncheon honouring her 40 years on the throne. Her voice was raspy from smoke inhalation, and she was suffering from a severe cold and a 101-degree fever. In her speech, she admitted that 1992 was not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. She continued, "In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis." The term was all too accurate. It was another bitterly cold day, with snow coating every surface in sight. The Queen was in Norfolk, England, receiving an address from a local mayor. Exactly 60 years earlier, her father, George VI, had died, passing the crown onto his eldest daughter. That made 2012 Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee, and the mayor's address marked the start of the festivities honouring her long years of service. After hearing him speak, Elizabeth dropped in at a nearby school, where the children gave a performance and celebrated her with 3 cheers. The following week, the Queen gave an address of her own at Lambeth Palace, her first major speech in the Jubilee year. The location was significant, the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury. This gave the ceremony a strong religious flavour, matched by the primary guests, 9 leaders from the most common faiths in Britain. As such, her address underlined her faith. Specifically, she emphasised the Church of England's role in fostering tolerance and cooperation in an increasingly diverse United Kingdom. After Elizabeth's address, the bulk of the Jubilee festivities began in March. Her children and grandchildren were sent around the world as her representatives, appearing at events and taking tours. They were also asked to accompany her on visits to 10 regions of the United Kingdom over the course of 5 months. By involving her descendants so deeply in the celebrations, the Queen signalled the increasing role that they would play in her royal affairs in the years to come. The first major event brought the Queen together with Camilla, Charles's consort, and Catherine, wife of Prince William. They met together for tea at the famous Piccadilly department store, Fortnum and Mason, which was meant to show a light-hearted, chummy side to the 3 women. At this point, support for the monarchy was nearly at an all-time high. Thanks to the positive polls, the Queen's planners felt confident enough to roll out regional tours in the traditionally anti-monarch Midlands and north of England, specifically in Leicester. The city was the most multicultural in Britain and thus presented an opportunity to celebrate the increasing multiculturality of the nation. Performances held there included Bollywood dancers, Sikh drummers, a Zimbabwean women's choir, Chinese umbrella dancers, and a traditional Anglican church service. On March 20th, the Queen addressed both Houses of Parliament in the 900-year-old Westminster Hall. It was only the 6th time in her reign that she had done so. In her speech, she invoked Britain's past, the continuity of our national story and the virtues of resilience, ingenuity and tolerance which created it, and she pledged to rededicate myself to the service of our great country. She acknowledged her husband Philip's strength and dedication to her, as well as her children's commitments to representing her overseas. Upon finishing the speech, the audience stood and clapped for 1.5 minutes. It was an acknowledgement of the Queen's poise, diplomacy, and commitment to the nation that she had for so long stood as a symbol. That's it. We've reached the end of these blinks to Elizabeth the Queen by Sally Bedell Smith. In February 2022, Queen Elizabeth II celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, the 70th anniversary of her accession to the throne. She is the first British monarch to have reigned for this long, having surpassed Queen Victoria's record in September 2015. After she passes away, her son, Prince Charles, will take the throne, and after him, her grandson, Prince William. Even as she ages into her 90s, the Queen remains high in spirits and mental fortitude, continuing to host engagements, attend meetings, and carry out her royal duties, though her children have also taken on increasing responsibility. Though she can't always escape the drama that often swirls around her close relatives, the Queen, in true British fashion, always manages to keep a stiff upper lip.